It's finished. It's over. There's more of them than us, and they look a lot bigger. The villain's got the girl and his fingers on the trigger. Voldemort, Sauron and Vader reign. It's gone to penalties against the Germans again. It's a terrible feeling when hope is erased, faith misplaced, virtue defaced, gloom embraced, reputation replaced with the taste of disgrace. When you've pushed every door and it's been slammed in your face, when you realise you're third in a two-horse race. So come sit with me on Golgotha's slopes. See human history at its lowest ebb. See the forces of goodness and grace on the ropes. Evil had spoken, last rites read. In a phony gown and thorny crown, he's mocked and knocked and shamed. As he staggers down through an angry town, they spit and hit and hate. Hands that forged galaxies and flung starry trails are pierced and punctured by merciless nails. His body succumbing to brutal infliction. These are the horrors of crucifixion. And as dice are tossed, hope is lost. Desolate disciples count the cost. King of the Jews, his headrest embossed, a criminal's killing on Calvary's cross. And as last words cut through foul-smelling air, the whole of the cosmos cries out in despair. It is finished. It's over. But then dawn breaks on Easter Day. Darkness quakes as shadows give way to the light. See, resurrection's the plan, it's why God sent him. And the comeback's on, there's a change of momentum. The powers of damnation in previous jubilation have been hushed and crushed by the Lord of creation. See, he takes the hit, stands where we should have stood, and that's why we call Friday good. And he's back with life and with us and blessed. And that's why we can know it as Sunday best. So to the 4-0 down, to the backs against the wall, listen to his rallying resurgent call. And to those up against it in brokenness and pain, Easter's story roars, we go again. So thine be the glory, death's lost its sting. Here's to Jesus, the comeback king.
I want to say thank you to the Evangelical Alliance and Phil Knox for making that video available so that everyone can marvel at the wonder of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but the Gospel writers put a lot of effort into describing the events during the last week of Jesus' earthly life, including his death and burial and right through to the resurrection. In fact, that 1 week takes up 29 chapters out of the 89 chapters in the Gospels. That's nearly a third of the Gospel chapters. So why is it that many churches tend to limit their preaching on a third of the Gospels to Easter week itself? Clearly, the Gospel writers felt it was more important than that. And so that's why today we're going to have another look at the events of the burial of Jesus and the resurrection. Easter may be a week ago, but this matters. It mattered to the people who wrote the Gospels, and it should matter to us. So here's how Matthew tells the story in Matthew 27, reading from verse 57. As the evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. So, verse 57 mentions a character called Joseph of Arimathea. What do we know about him? Well, Joseph was a member of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish ruling council, and he was a disciple of Jesus. Luke's gospel adds in the detail that he had opposed the plot to kill Jesus. And if we jump across to John's account of events, we'll find that Joseph was a secret disciple, and that when he visited Pilate to ask for Jesus' body, he wasn't alone. He went with Nicodemus, and the two of them wanted Jesus' body so that they could bury him with dignity. This is how John describes it in John 19 from verse 38. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds, or if you're in metric, that's about 35 kilos. So it's quite a lot. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. Now, all across the Roman Empire, the Romans' practice was that they didn't bury crucified criminals. They just dumped the bodies on the ground and left them to rot. In Israel, the Jews couldn't accept that because they always took great care to bury the dead. So in Jerusalem, the Jewish leaders would have intended to have buried the bodies of the three being executed in a shared grave in a public plot. Crucified criminals were never buried reverently in a private tomb. So it's part of the wonder of Easter that Jesus was buried reverently in a private tomb, thanks to the intervention of these two prominent men, one of whom generously gave away his own tomb, and the other generously gave very large amounts of spices. And then the tomb was sealed with a heavy stone. But why does any of this matter? Well, if the normal Roman custom of just dumping the body had happened, then the disappearance of Jesus' body would have been put down to dogs or a marauding hyena. So it's a vital part of the evidence for the resurrection that Jesus was buried in this way. An unmarked shared hole in the ground would also have been a problem, because who would notice if the body went missing? The reason we know that Jesus rose from the grave is because there was an individual grave, and that grave was carefully sealed and guarded. And yet, in spite of all that, the grave ended up empty. But if you think about it, Joseph and Nicodemus could in no way have understood the significance of what they were doing when they buried Jesus in this way. They thought they were simply respecting the body of a friend who had been killed. But in fact, as I say, that simple but extravagant act of love forms the bedrock of the evidence for Jesus rising from the dead. And how cool is that? And how often does God work like that, using an act of love to have a significance way beyond anything anybody can imagine? Who knows what significance Michelle and Bridget's Kindness Project may have in helping people just at the time when they need love. Who knows how a relatively small display of love may help people through hard times. But it's God's habit that he can use these seemingly small acts of love to bring about large effects. So I'd encourage you to persist in looking for ways to do these small acts of love, whether through the Kindness Project or in your encounters with all the people around you. Keep showing God's love, because you never know the significance of what you are doing. Now, it's become commonly believed by Christians that the stone that sealed the tomb would have been a disc like a millstone. Selva, could you possibly put up that slide that came up a while ago, slide 3? Thank you. And so it's a disc like a millstone which is rolled down a groove to seal the entrance. And Christians have tended to believe that is the sort of tomb Jesus had. The problem with this understanding is that archaeologists tend to disagree. In fact, they've only ever found 4 tombs of this type in the Jerusalem area and from around the right date. And all 4 belonged to members of the royal family, not ordinary people. So it's not impossible that that's the sort of tomb Jesus was put in, but it is rather unlikely. The other roughly 900 tombs from that period that have been found were all like you can see in the slide here. Now, these have a heavy stone shaped something like a champagne cork, and this is much more likely to have been the type of stone used. And I think that photo makes it very clear why the women were worried about who's going to roll away the stone. They might possibly have managed to roll a disc in a groove, but it would have been much harder to shift this type of stone stopper. Anyway, moving on to the events of the next day, Matthew 27 from verse 62. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." "Take a guard," Pilate answered. "Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. So in these verses, the worst nightmare of the Jewish leaders was that Jesus' disciples might steal the body and try to fake the resurrection. Now, the Jewish leaders could have sent their own temple guards to guard the tomb, but it seems that they were so worried about Jesus' disciples that they went and hassled Pilate to send Roman guards to do the job. You've got to wonder what Pilate thought of this whole bunch of leaders. I mean, Pilate has to rule over the whole province. He's got to try and get through the Passover feast without any major armed uprising by the Jews. And yet he's got these paranoid leaders hassling him about a dead body. But anyway, he went along with it and gave the order for Roman troops to go and guard a tomb. That's the original graveyard shift. So the Roman soldiers went with the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they did the full official Roman thing of putting a seal on the tomb. Now, the seal on the tomb is something like you're seeing on screen now. We're not talking about half a ton of cement to stop people moving the stone. It's more like a customs seal on a modern shipping container. And a couple of strings would have been stretched over the doorway and then stuck into a blob of clay at either side. And then a Roman signet ring or a seal would be stuck into the clay while it was still wet, so that when the clay dried, it was impossible to open the tomb undetected. And the seal carried the full authority of the Roman Empire. The Romans were putting their authority on the line and saying that this tomb is officially closed. And anyone who tampered with the seal would be killed. And then they posted guards and took it in turns to keep watch throughout the day and then through the night. Matthew doesn't tell us how many guards there were, but the Roman army normally worked in units of 16, which meant that when they were fighting, they could form squares with 4 men facing outwards on each side of the square. And these squares were famous for being able to defend their piece of territory against a much greater attacking force. Of course, in this case, when they're on guard duty, they wouldn't have been in fighting formation. But if Pilate had sent a squad of 16, that would have allowed them to have 4 subunits of 4 soldiers each to take each watch. And it's believed that the Roman military way would have been to have probably 4 guards on duty at all times and the others resting beside them and available in case of any trouble. So although Matthew doesn't mention the number of guards, it does seem likely that it would have been 16 or a multiple of 16, depending on how big a crowd Pilate thought might try to steal the body. So now you have the whole weight of the leaders of the Old Testament people of God, the whole of the religious authority, the best intellects in the land, the whole of the political establishment, and the whole might of the Roman Empire, including the Roman army, trying to keep a dead body in a grave. How hard could it be? Well, we know what happens next. Matthew 28, reading from verse 1. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now, I've told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly, Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Don't be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." Please never lose the wonder of that amazing event. We've heard the story so often that I think we don't take it in. But imagine if you were actually there. There was a violent earthquake, and an angel appeared, all glowing and shiny white, and he rolled back the stone. And these Roman guards were so petrified that they shook and either fainted with fright or became paralyzed with fright. these big, strong, well-armed, experienced military guys either keeled over and fainted or became paralyzed. That's quite an event. I mean, these soldiers drilled constantly. They practiced with their weapons daily. They practiced going into their defensive square again and again and again. And they could have defended the grave against hundreds of Jesus's rabble of followers. Yet this event was so scary that they just all fainted or became paralyzed. That's quite some scary angel. And interestingly, it doesn't appear as if the angel opened the tomb to let Jesus out. None of the Gospels suggest that anybody saw Jesus come out of the tomb. Indeed, from the guard's account, it seems as if Jesus had already escaped before the tomb was opened. So rather than letting Jesus out, what happened was that the angel opened the tomb to let the followers of Jesus in so that they could see that he had risen. So in verse 5, you have the angel saying to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He's not here. He has risen just as he said." But that dropped the guards right in it. The seal was broken, the stone had been moved, and the dead body had escaped. How could they explain that without Pilate executing them for failing to guard the tomb properly? And that was the most likely outcome. We can see this happening a few years later after God sent an angel to break Peter out of jail. In Acts 12, verse 18, it says, "In the morning, there was no small commotion among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. After Herod had a thorough search made for him and didn't find him, he cross-examined the guards and ordered that they be executed." So the guards couldn't go to Pilate to explain what had happened. They'd have been killed. So what did they do? Well, Matthew continues the story in Matthew 28, verse 11. "While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, 'You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day." Pilate wouldn't have gone to check on the grave, but I think it's pretty likely that the chief priests would have done so. And if they complained to Pilate about a missing body, then the soldiers were dead. So instead of telling their officers or telling Pilate what had happened, some of the soldiers went to see the chief priests. They were terrified. Their lives were in serious danger. But in one sense, this is also one of the funniest bits of the Bible. I mean, can you imagine what the soldiers said to the chief priests? Can you imagine how they explained the escape of a dead body? I mean, what could the soldiers say that wouldn't get them killed? I sort of imagine them walking in and telling the chief priests that they've got some good news and they've got some bad news. The good news was that the disciples hadn't stolen Jesus' body. The bad news was that an angel had appeared and rolled the stone away, and Jesus' body had gone. And to make matters worse, Jesus is currently alive again and wandering around the garden chattering to a group of women. How on earth did they explain all that without getting killed? And then we see once again how evil and corrupt the Jewish leaders really were. The guards' story was really bad news for them, because if Jesus had risen from the dead after they'd killed him, what would happen when the crowds heard about it? The uprising they had feared would have happened. And the Jewish leaders would have been in deep trouble. But I don't think they believed the guards about Jesus being alive again. And whether the reports were true or not, the chief priests had to do something, because word would spread. So they came up with a Baldric-like cunning plan and decided that they would bribe the guards to spread a false rumor that Jesus' disciples had stolen the body in the night when they were asleep. That would solve the problem of Jesus being raised from the dead, wouldn't it? Ironically, this is exactly the thing that the chief priests were terrified of the day before, but suddenly it seemed a whole lot better than considering the possibility that God had raised his son from the dead. Now, sadly, throughout human history, there's always been some people who go out of their way to oppose God and attack God's people. Here we see the Jewish leaders who are supposed to lead the nation in following God, putting enormous effort into opposing God. They had deliberately killed Jesus because they hated him. His trial was rigged and completely against Jewish law. And now when they had reliable evidence that Jesus had risen from the dead, they didn't believe it, and they tried to hide the facts. They tried to hide the most amazing miracle of all time and call it a theft instead. So at every turn, they opposed God and opposed the things that God was doing. So in the Easter story, you can see that men tried their utmost to stop the purposes of God. The chief priests used all their political skills and corruption and hatred. Pilate used all the trappings of empire. The soldiers used all the might and skill of the Roman army. But in the end, all these things came to nothing. They united together and tried to stop the purposes of God, but they failed completely, because God can never be stopped. So today I want to encourage you with this message. God can never be stopped. On Easter Saturday, things looked terrible from the point of view of Jesus' disciples. They looked hopeless. Jesus had been killed. His body was locked away in a tomb with an enormous rock and a Roman seal on the rock and Roman guards all around. And nobody could get that body out of the tomb except Pilate himself. And even if the body was retrieved, Jesus was still dead, and nobody comes back from that. Or so it appeared to human eyes. But God's more powerful than the things we can see in this world. And God raised Jesus from the dead, and there was nothing the Jewish leaders could do, and nothing the whole might of the Roman Empire could do to stop God or hinder God in any way. That's brilliant, isn't it? But how often do we hear people saying that something is impossible? Indeed, how often do we fail and fall into believing that ourselves? How often do we say, it's impossible? How often do we lose hope? But when we fall into that pattern of thought, in effect, we're saying to God, you can't do that. But the message of the resurrection is that God can do whatever he wants in this world he created. So be encouraged that even though circumstances look impossible, even though people tell us to look for the silver lining, but all we can see is darkness, even though everyone has long since given up hope, with God, nothing is impossible. So don't feel overwhelmed by the challenges facing you. God is bigger than the challenges. He's bigger than any human opposition. He's bigger than the greatest of empires. He's bigger than the most powerful army. He's bigger than the forces of evil. He's bigger than sin and death. And he's bigger than everything that appears impossible, because nothing is impossible to God. The truth of the resurrection and that the hope that it brings to mankind is for life. It's not just for Easter. So let's put it at the center of our lives. With God, nothing is impossible, because the resurrection is for life, not just for Easter. Thanks for listening. May God bless you.